Hello and welcome to this exploration of one of the most fascinating periods in human history, the space race. I'm going to take you on a journey through the Cold War rivalry that propelled humanity into the cosmos, from the first artificial satellites to the moon landings and beyond. This competition between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't just about scientific achievement, it was a battle for technological superiority, national prestige, and ideological supremacy. As we delve into this era, we'll see how the space race shaped not only the future of space exploration, but also the course of global politics and technological innovation. Now, you might be wondering why two superpowers would pour vast resources into sending people and machines into the hostile environment of space. Well, it all stems from the tensions of the Cold War. Both sides saw space as the ultimate high ground, a place where they could demonstrate their technological prowess and, by extension, the superiority of their political and economic systems. The space race wasn't just about exploration. It was about showing the world which superpower had the most advanced rockets, the best scientists and the most daring astronauts or cosmonauts. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The roots of the space race can be traced back to the Second World War and the development of ballistic missiles. The German V2 rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun, was the first long-range ballistic missile to be used in combat. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to acquire German rocket technology and expertise. The Soviets captured many of the V2 production facilities, while the Americans managed to bring von Braun and many of his top engineers to the US through Operation Paperclip. This transfer of knowledge and technology laid the groundwork for the space programs of both nations. In the Soviet Union, the brilliant engineer Sergei Korolev led the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would later be adapted for space launches. Korolev's R-7 rocket, first successfully tested in August 1957, became the basis for the Soviet space program. It's worth noting that the R-7 was a massive leap forward in rocket technology, capable of delivering a nuclear warhead across continents. This dual-use nature of rocket technology, for both military and space applications, was a key factor in driving the space race forward. We will bury you. The Americans, meanwhile, were developing their own rocket technology. While von Braun and his team worked on the Redstone and Jupiter rockets for the Army, the Air Force was pursuing its own programs. However, the US efforts were somewhat fragmented compared to the more centralized Soviet approach. This fragmentation would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the American space program. The space race truly began on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. I remember reading about the impact this had on the American psyche. It was nothing short of seismic. Sputnik was a relatively simple device, essentially a metal sphere about the size of a beach ball with 4 external radio antennas, but its impact was enormous. As it passed overhead, emitting a simple beeping signal, it declared to the world that the Soviet Union had achieved a significant technological feat that the United States had not. Beep, beep, beep. The launch of Sputnik created what became known as the Sputnik crisis in the United States. There was a widespread fear that the Soviet Union had surpassed America in scientific and technological capabilities. This fear wasn't just about prestige, there were genuine concerns about national security. After all, if the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could potentially put a nuclear weapon in orbit as well. The American government and public alike were galvanized into action. In response to Sputnik, the United States government took several significant steps. President Eisenhower created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in 1958 to coordinate and lead America's civilian space efforts. The government also poured resources into science and technology education, passing the National Defense Education Act. This act provided funding for education in science, mathematics, and modern foreign languages, aiming to produce the scientists and engineers needed to compete with the Soviet Union. After the shock of Sputnik, Both superpowers set their sights on the next great achievement, putting a human being into space. The Soviets, once again, took the lead. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in his Vostok 1 spacecraft. Gagarin's flight lasted 108 minutes, during which he completed a single orbit of the Earth. The Soviet Union had scored another major victory in the space race. "I see Earth! It is so beautiful!" The United States was not far behind, however. Less than a month after Gagarin's flight, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Shepard's flight on Freedom 7 was suborbital, reaching an altitude of 116 miles before splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean. While it didn't match Gagarin's orbital flight, it was still a significant achievement and helped to restore some confidence in the American space program. These early human spaceflights were incredibly risky endeavours. The spacecraft were essentially experimental vehicles, and the effects of spaceflight on the human body were not fully understood. Both the American Mercury capsule and the Soviet Vostok were cramped, with barely enough room for a single occupant. The cosmonauts and astronauts who flew these missions were true pioneers, venturing into the unknown at great personal risk. It's worth noting that while the Soviet Union publicly celebrated its successes, it kept its failures secret. We now know that there were several failed launches, and possibly even cosmonaut deaths that were covered up at the time. The early Soviet successes in space put enormous pressure on the United States to catch up and surpass its Cold War rival. This pressure culminated in one of the most ambitious declarations in human history. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress and set forth a bold national goal: to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This speech, which I've always found incredibly stirring, marked a turning point in the space race. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Kennedy's declaration was a massive gamble. At the time, the United States had only managed to put a man into space on a suborbital flight. The technology required to land on the moon didn't exist yet, but Kennedy understood the power of a clear, ambitious goal to mobilize a nation's resources and imagination. The Apollo program, as it came to be known, would become one of the largest peacetime mobilizations of resources and manpower in American history. The Soviet Union, for its part, initially downplayed the significance of Kennedy's declaration. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, refused to publicly confirm or deny whether the USSR was pursuing a moon landing program. In reality, the Soviets did initiate their own lunar program, but it was plagued by technical difficulties and a lack of funding. The death of Sergei Korolev in 1966 was a severe blow to the Soviet space program, as he had been the driving force behind many of their early successes. The culmination of the space race came on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 mission. I remember watching the grainy black and white footage of Armstrong descending the ladder of the lunar module and uttering those immortal words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." It was a moment of unparalleled achievement, not just for the United States, but for all of humanity. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. The moon landing was the result of an enormous effort involving hundreds of thousands of people working towards a common goal. It required numerous technological innovations, from the powerful Saturn V rocket to the lunar module that would actually land on the moon's surface. The Apollo guidance computer, which controlled the spacecraft, was a marvel of miniaturization for its time, though it had less computing power than a modern smartphone. The success of Apollo 11 was followed by several more lunar missions, each pushing the boundaries of what was possible in lunar exploration. The later Apollo missions included longer stays on the lunar surface, the use of the lunar roving vehicle, and more extensive scientific experiments. However, public interest in the moon landings waned surprisingly quickly. The last moon landing, Apollo 17, took place in December 1972, just 3 years after the first. Since then, no human has set foot on the lunar surface, although there have been numerous robotic missions. The space race, while born out of Cold War rivalry, had profound impacts that went far beyond geopolitics. It spurred incredible technological advancements, many of which have found applications in everyday life. Things we take for granted today, like satellite communications, weather forecasting and GPS navigation, all have their roots in the space programs of the 1960s. The miniaturization of electronics required for spacecraft played a crucial role in the development of modern computers and smartphones. Perhaps more importantly, the space race changed our perspective on our planet and our place in the universe. The famous Earthrise photo, taken by Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders in 1968, showed Earth as a fragile blue marble suspended in the vastness of space. This image is often credited with kickstarting the environmental movement, as it viscerally demonstrated the limited nature of our planet's resources. We came all this way to explore the Moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth. In the years following the Apollo program, space exploration has taken on a more cooperative character. The International Space Station, a joint project involving space agencies from the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, stands as a testament to how former rivals can work together in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Today, we're seeing a new kind of space race, with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin competing alongside national space agencies to push the boundaries of space exploration. As we look to the future, with plans to return to the Moon and eventually send humans to Mars, the legacy of the original space race continues to inspire and drive us forward. As we conclude our journey through the space race, I'm struck by the sheer scale of human achievement it represents. In just over a decade, we went from launching our first artificial satellites to walking on the surface of another world. It's a testament to what we can accomplish when we set our minds to a task, even if that task initially seems impossible. The space race showed us the best of human ingenuity, courage, and determination. We choose to go to the Moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Yet it's also important to remember the context in which these achievements took place. The space race was, at its core, an extension of the Cold War. The enormous resources poured into space exploration came at the expense of other potential uses. We should also consider the human cost, the astronauts and cosmonauts who lost their lives in the pursuit of these goals. Their sacrifices should not be forgotten. Looking forward, I believe the lessons of the space race are more relevant than ever. As we face global challenges like climate change and potential pandemics, the space race shows us what we can achieve when we mobilize our resources and talents towards a common goal. It also reminds us of the importance of international cooperation. While competition drove the initial space race, cooperation has defined much of space exploration since. As we look to the stars and dream of Mars and beyond, let's remember the spirit of discovery and cooperation that the space race, at its best, embodied. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most fascinating periods in human history. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the space race, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Your support really does make a difference, and do let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to cover in future videos.